Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, before I begin and give you our constructive case, I would like to cover a brief part of history, and not so a history which took place not so long ago, a couple of 100 years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, China has conquered Tibet around 200 years ago. They now control the area, and not so long ago, when the Tibetans wanted independence, they pleaded for independence, and China killed them. They brutally murdered thousands of Tibetans. They expelled the Dalai Lama, who is the religious leader of the Tibetan people. They do not give the Tibetan people what they clearly deserve, and that is our problem today. Ladies and gentlemen, China is controlling Tibet, not wrongfully controlling Tibet. They are taking advantage of the people. They are killing them, butchering them every so often, and China is clearly hurting Tibet's rights. And we believe that China needs to consider the full sovereignty of Tibet and give them independence so that Tibet can live peacefully, so that Tibetans will no longer be in danger and their full rights will be preserved, and they can express themselves in any way they wish. Ladies and gentlemen, today we have 3 constructive points for you. The first is the criteria for the country and how the Tibetans fill this criteria. The second point is the correct way. Why should we expel them from the community of nations? And the third point, which is presented to you by our second speaker, is the world's job and duty. Ladies and gentlemen, let's begin by telling you a few pieces of criteria we have for giving people a land, giving them a country, giving them independence and sovereignty. First of all, we have the ethnicity. We need the people to be a united people. We need them to be a group. They need to have the same. They need to be a part of the same ethnic group. They need to have the same religion, perhaps the same religion, perhaps the same culture as. Perhaps the same culture, the same language. No, thank you. So basically, the ethnicity is our main thing that we need to prove to you today. Second thing is the same history. They need to have the same history, to be a part, to have the same ancestors, and so on. The third thing they need is a territory, and the fourth is a leader. Now, if we fill this criteria, we will move on to the second piece of criteria, is when we give a people a land. Just a second. And these are our 3 criteria. First of all, if they answer our previous criteria. The second thing is if they want this country, and the third is if they really need this country. Yes, please.
Yes, but don't you think a violent act of force like the one you're proposing might actually just take China out of diplomatic relations and shut them out?
No, China will not be shut out. We are not permanently expelling them from the community of nations. We are just giving them a timed ban until they understand sovereignty of Tibet, until they realize that Tibet is a real country. So basically, they need to understand that Tibet is a country and they will not be harmed in such a severe way. Now to our first point. First of all, the ethnicity. To be a part of an ethnic group, for us to have an ethnic group, they need to be a part of the same ethnic group. That means that they need to define themselves the same way, and the people in Tibet clearly do. They define themselves as Tibetic, as the people of Tibet who have lived in Tibet before China has conquered them, violently conquered them. So basically, they see themselves, no thank you, as a part of an ethnic group. They want to be a part of this ethnic group, and clearly, history points at that they are a part of an ethnic group. They are united, and they are considered themselves as a people. No, thank you. Now to the part of the religion. First of all, the people of Tibet are Buddhists. They have the same religion, led by the Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama to be precise. They have the same religion. They also have the same culture and past, the same history. A country they were Tibetans before they were conquered. So basically, that is it. Their religion is the same. Yes, please.
We think this is all wonderful, but why are you assuming that threatening China in this particular way is going to make them give up Tibet?
As I will explain this. Thank you for saying that, and I will explain this in our second point. So basically, they have the same religion. We agree on that. They also have the same language, which is Tibetan. So they are a part of the same ethnic group. They are the same ethnic group. We call them Tibetans. Now, the second thing in our criteria is the same history. In fact, they had a country. They were a united people. They had the same history, and they were and they had a country basically. They have similar, they have the same ancestors, they have the same land. Basically, their history points that they are united. The third thing is a territory, and the territory is the Tibetan province, which was once a country but is now a part of China. So they also have a territory, Tibet. And the fourth thing, the leader is clearly the Dalai Lama, who leads them right now but is exiled and is now in India. No, thank you. Now, why should we give a country independence? Why should we give Tibet an independence? Now, if they answer the previous criteria we gave you, and they clearly do, they are worthy of being considered of giving a country, so that is it. We should consider giving them a country. Now, do they want a country? Yes, they do. They have been protesting for years, and no thank you, and wishing and pleading China for independence, and they have now received it. They still want this country, still want their independence and sovereignty. Now, if they have no other choice, if they are in dire danger, and the fact is they are, we cannot stress enough how the danger of the people of Tibet is right now. They are being harassed by China. They do not have their full rights, and they are being butchered when China feels like killing them. This is very, very important, and they need a country to defend themselves. No country, they will keep being harassed, they will keep being killed, so they clearly need a country. They answer both criteria, so Tibet deserves being a country. Now, our second point is the correct way. Thank you. Why is expelling them from the community? It will basically make China understand that Tibet is a real country. It's sovereignty. Now, basically, China right now is main export. Their main way of income is export. They export many goods, most of the goods in the world actually, and they need this way of income. They require it. They have basically no other way of making money. This is very, very important to them, as we see right now. No, thank you. It is their main and most important way of getting money, getting food, and basically, if we shut them down, we do not. If we will not trade with them, if we will expel them from the UN, they will have a less income, and they will basically less cash for them, less money for them. The country will go poor for a short time, obviously, not forever. And basically, they will have no other way of survival. They will want to give Tibet back. They will want to give up this land if they want to live. Now, the second thing is why exactly expel them from the UN. Now, if we expel them from the UN because of what they did, because they control Tibet not rightfully, they will understand that this is a bad thing. They will understand how we do not accept these bad things. They will understand how much of a shame this is for us to have them in our community. And basically, this will give them a message that they are doing a bad thing. They should surrender Tibet. And when they understand their enormous moral damage, they will surrender Tibet. So basically, I just showed you why this is the best way possible, because they will have no other means of supplying themselves with food, and because they understand how bad it is. Now, to conclude my speech, I showed you why Tibet deserves a country and why this is the best way possible. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, honorable judges, worthy opponents, and esteemed colleagues. We are here on side opposition today to show you why this resolution must and will fall, and we're going to do that for you in a number of steps today. Now, before I get into the constructed material and the signposting and the rebuttal, I first want to talk about the context within which side opposition is actually going to come to you with this resolution today. So ladies and gentlemen, we're going to bring you the stance that not that we think that China shouldn't return Tibet, but that we actually think exiling China from the international community is the wrong way to do it. And we're going to argue today that exiling China is the wrong way to achieve this goal, and that instead we think it's going to be better to keep the existing diplomatic links that we already currently have open and existing. We think this is actually going to do a better job of achieving this goal. So with that, we've set two burdens in mind for side opposition today. We think that number one, we have to prove that Prop's plan is not going to ensure the return of Tibet, and that number two, severing relations is going to be harmful not only for this issue, but have implications worldwide. It's under this context that we're going to come to you with the case line today. If you push China too hard, it's going to shatter. But before I move into that, let's take a quick look at what we've seen from side proposition so far. Now, the first problem we've had on this side of the room today is that we haven't seen any real clear model from proposition today of how they're going to put their plan into action. We haven't seen any good idea of how they're going to, I'll take you in a minute, bring China and block them from the international community. Yes?
We told you that first all the world will stop trading with China gradually, and then we're going to ban them through UN until they recognize Tibet as a country.
Okay, thanks very much. So now that we have a model from side proposition, we have two inherent problems that we want to address immediately. The first idea we've seen here is that we're going to ban China from trading with the rest of the world. They've talked about how big China's economy is. They've talked about how much it trades with the rest of the world. We actually think there's a huge problem with stopping China's trade with the rest of the world. I'm actually going to address this further in my constructive material, but China is one of the world's biggest economies and has a lot of trade with a lot of different countries. We think by doing this, you actually harm greatly the international community. We don't think this is the best way to actually achieve this. Now, the last thing we've seen from side proposition today is this idea that China took Tibet unfairly and that that's not okay. Like I've already given you in context, however, we're not arguing against this idea that China shouldn't have Tibet or vice versa. We just think that these harsh sanctions, sanction them, eventually removing them from the UN is going to have problems. We think that cutting their dialogue by eventually doing things like taking China out of the UN is actually going to make the problem worse. And I'm actually going to address both these things further when I move into my constructive. I'm talking about constructive a lot, so let's do it. We think there are three things that side opposition is going to bring to you today. The first two ideas are going to come from me, and that's number one, why we don't think China is going to give up Tibet through force, and number two, the global consequences. Our second speaker, Andrew, today is going to go on to talk about the internal consequences when we support Prop's resolution. So we're now going to move into the constructive material today. And the first idea here is why we don't think China is going to give up Tibet through force. So we think expelling China from the international community is not going to make China give up Tibet. And we think that at this point in our negotiations, they aren't necessarily ready to sacrifice their image and take the leaps and bounds they're going to need to in order to give up Tibet immediately through war. Not necessarily war, economic sanctions, and eventually dispelling them from the UN. So we think China is extremely concerned about their image. We've seen it in events like when they hosted the 2008 Beijing Olympics. We've seen their determination to hold the territory in places like the South China Sea. China is a place we recognize has a lot of resources, infrastructure at their disposal. We don't think they're going to give up Tibet unwillingly immediately through the sudden act of aggression from the international community. So we just think that China is not yet at a point where we can encourage them to get it up immediately with this international action. We think the diplomatic relations we actually already have in process are moving towards this goal. We think we're actually seeing progress, and we think that as long as we keep moving along this line, we actually have a better way to do this. Yes?
But while these diplomatic relations are in progress, Tibetan people getting killed, Tibetan people don't get independence, Tibetan people are don't have a country because of China.
Okay, great. Well, our second speaker is actually going to address this in our constructive material. But essentially what we think is that by the international community immediately blocking off China, China's harsh response to both the people in China and particularly in Tibet is going to make those conditions a lot worse. We actually think that China is going to really hate the people in Tibet, exhibit bad actions towards them, and we think the situation that you think is bad is going to get even worse. So moving on with this constructive material, we think that diplomatic relations are making progress. At the same time, we think if you push China too hard right away, they're going to snap. An example of this is recently when the international community actually awarded a Nobel Peace Prize to a radical activist in China. This was pushing too hard. China had an extremely harsh response, and they immediately restricted the civil rights of this individual. We think you're pushing too hard. Instead, what we think we need to do is to continue to talk with China and keep these channels open. We've seen relations improve in ways like ping-pong diplomacy between the US and China, and we've seen concrete results. We've seen that rights for the people are improving. We've seen that we are going to a level where the international relationship between the international community and China is growing to the point where they can do things like host the Olympic Games. But we do think there is a difference between international threatening and international diplomacy. We don't think China is going to give up this area immediately, and we think that actually doing this is going to reverse any of the progress we've actually already made so far. So now I'm going to move on to the second big idea we have on side opposition today, and that's the global consequences. I've actually referenced this a little bit in my rebuttal already, but essentially what we're going to argue here is that shutting China out of the world is going to have huge consequences for the international community. So the first prong of this argument is that we're not just talking about Tibet. We think there are a lot of other issues where China is engaged in negotiations. We're continuing to talk with them about things like human rights. We're conversing with them about the international trade community and other territorial disputes. We think that when the international community suddenly shows this resent towards China, we're actually going to stop all the other dialogue and conversation as well. We think that by stopping all this dialogue and conversation at once, we're actually not only going back on all the things we've already done, but we limit our ability to talk with China in a diplomatic manner. The second prong of this argument is the economic one. And they've already talked about how important China's economy is and how important it is and how strong it is to the rest of the world. Well, we actually think that's a problem, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that when you immediately stop trading with China, you actually have huge economic consequences that you're going to bestow on the rest of the world. So we see that China's invested billions of dollars in foreign places like Africa. They've brought up debt from the European countries, and they've also helped bail out the US in the housing crisis. China's been helping the economic community. They've been doing it because it's in their best interest to keep their options open. But when we think we sever these economic trading links with China, the damage isn't just to China. And in fact, there's even a greater damage to the international community that lies, or that depends on such a huge economy. So ladies and gentlemen, today I've talked about the two first ideas on side opposition, why we don't think China is going to give Tibet up through an automatic response of force, how we think there are huge global consequences not only with the other relations we have with China, but also with things like the diplomatic relations and the economics. It's for these reasons, the reasons we're going to continue to bring up on side opposition today, that we truly think we should pose this resolution, that we truly think that if you push China too hard, ladies and gentlemen, it will shatter. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, to begin with our case, we'd like to first of all repeat our definition again and our plan, how these things are going to work. Second of all, I'd like to repeat again the second idea that we proposed about the fact that China will work by this plan and things will happen, not like the opposition team came up with. Then I'm going to rebut the other team's points, and I'm going to present with our third argument why exactly in this case this is the world's job to do these things. So first of all, Team Opposition came out and had many arguments about the fact that we are stopping all the economic connections with China in a boom. That in a second everything will explode. But we, in our definition, define it as stop trading with them gradually. That once we will stop a little bit, then a little bit more, then a little bit more. We will put growing stress on China to give Tibet a full sovereignty. Now, in addition, in our second point, we talked to you about why exactly will China do this. Now, as we've already said, we'll state again, China, no thank you. China is relying a lot about the economy of the whole world. Its main way to make money is to export things out. Once the world will not trade with China, China will collapse very soon. China won't be able to last a very long amount of time alone by not trading with other people. In this amount of time, we believe, no thank you, we believe that because of this exact reason, China will not suffer this for too long time and will grant Tibet its full sovereignty. Now, let's begin to rebutting the other team's points. Now, just a second. They talked a lot about the fact that there are many diplomatic relations with China and talking about human rights and talking about other issues in China that the modern world basically doesn't like. However, the issue with Tibet, that these things are going on for 200 years. These things are critic. These things cannot last longer. And there's a huge difference between diplomacy, which we agree that this is a good solution. However, it does not help solving the problem immediately. This is what we need. This is what we think is the right thing to do. And there's a huge difference between just talking about things and actually doing things. No, thank you. And we believe that what we need to do in this specific case, in this exact case, is to do something. And the best plan is to intervene, that the whole world will intervene by, no, thank you, by putting our plan to work. So now I'd like to move to the second point. Why exactly is it the world's job to do these things? So, first of all, we believe that to be a part of a group means that you accept on you certain rules, certain ideas, ideologies, certain things that got you in. You should respect other people for having these things too. By that, just to make it simpler for everyone to understand, we're just saying that if, for example, you want to join the Boy Scouts, for example, you have to accept certain rules, and you can't act against these rules towards someone else. Now, once China got to count as a country, it got to this group of countries because the group respects China as a country according to our criteria, as we've already shown you in our first speech. Now, once China does not respect these things about another country, Tibet in this case, just a second, we believe that few things happen, but first of all, yeah.
So understanding that China already doesn't respect Tibet, don't you think when you put international pressure on China, China could actually become more resentful towards Tibet?
No, thank you, but no, because China will not take the chance of suiciding economically by taking over a small country that they don't really care about. It's just an ego thing. So no, thank you. So once we put such a huge pressure on China, they will not take that chance. No, thank you. Now, once China does not respect these things about another country, does not respect these criteria, first of all, it clashes its own definition of being a country, of the fact that China is basically a country, and under this logic, China is very much going against the idea that any country is a country. Now, we as the community of nations, as the group of countries that China belongs to, why do we have the obligation to stop these things from going on? And in this case, to put these economical sanctions and banning them for a certain amount of time from the UN. Now, why do we have this? Now, we put ourselves certain criteria, just a second. Okay, sure.
Okay, so we haven't argued today about the relationship between China and Tibet. We've just argued today that forcing these actions upon China is the wrong way to do it.
Okay, but we are saying that this is exactly the right way to do this, and because this is the right way to do it, all the worlds of the country are the ones that should take should be responsible for taking this specific action, because all the worlds of the countries together will be able to prevent China from continuing doing these things in Tibet. So, once the whole world has a certain idea, certain criteria to define themselves as a country, and according to this idea, Tibet is a country, by not following, no thank you, by not following this definition as agreed in most of the universe, so China not only clashes the legitimacy of Tibet to be a country, as I've already told you, but a legitimacy of every country to be a country. Now, because its importance to be a country and the importance of people to being able to define themselves as a country, we as the world see through history, can also see through history its importance, that many people fought for independence, many people had various independence wars that ended up with them having a country, with them being united with all the people. But once a country has no other option but to surrender, because the Tibetans' religion is basically Buddhism, and which is against war, so we as the world are the ones who should take this step. And one of the best, we are the ones who should intervene. Now, one of the, one of the best solutions that the world can take, considering the fact that diplomatic relationships have been going on not for a short time and not have been working so far since Tibet is still under the custody and weight of China. No, thank you. Now, since we see these things do not work, this is our job as the world to come, to unite, and to do something that the whole world can affect on, which in this case is, no, thank you, which in this case is, are treating China, are excluding China from the group of countries. So we think that this is the solution. This is the countries who should do this for the greater good of Tibet being free, no matter what small cost, as we've already shown you, it will take on our society. Now, as the world, so in my speech and throughout all our case, we showed you, first of all, why Tibet deserves to be a country, why Tibet should be a country. But most of all, because we agreed on all this, most of all we think that we showed you why this is the right step to take as the whole world to be able to free Tibet, basically, and because of the fact that this is the only step that will, in 100% sure, will work, and this is a step that is not only talking about this, this is a step that will actually do something. So thank you, and I beg you to propose.
Good evening, judges, honorable opponents, and esteemed colleagues. We are gathered here today to discuss the resolution. This House believes that China should be exiled from the community of nations until it recognizes the full sovereignty of Tibet. We on side opposition are, of course, firmly opposed to this resolution, and we bring our case to you under the case line, if you push China too hard, it will shatter. I'd like to begin my speech by rebutting some statements that the proposition side has made. Now, an overwhelming theme that happened in the speeches made by both the first and second proposition speakers was that the relationship between China and Tibet is rather strained. This is not the subject of the debate, however, as we would like to point out. We see that it is widely acknowledged that the Chinese invasion of Tibet was unfair and that relations between China and Tibet are not good. But this is not the subject of debate. We on side opposition would like to point out that it is possible to liberate Tibet, but the answer is not through using such brutal force, I'll take you in a moment, on China. We see that in recent years, the amount of
progress made on Chinese human rights has accelerated with exactly the same pace as the amount of peaceful and non-aggressive diplomacy that has been put on China's plate. Yes?
If this progress is so effective, why hasn't Tibet been freed yet, considering that the UN has been trying for 40 years or more?
We see that Tibet has not been freed yet because China is still a work in progress. If it weren't a work in progress, this wouldn't be our case right now. And all the diplomacy that we've been talking about wouldn't be happening. China is not perfect yet, but we see that through international diplomacy that is non-aggressive, peaceful, and non-threatening, the situation between China and Tibet will improve over the years. We're not saying it will happen quickly. We say that side proposition is in fact using too much haste in their argument. Now, another problem with the proposition case was that they didn't introduce a model until too late in the speech. However, seeing that their model only came up in the second speaker's speech, we see that it would also be fitting to attack that model in our second speaker's speech. So, as my partner stated, China is far too attached to, first of all, Tibet itself and all the resources that it provides, and second of all, its image, to let go of Tibet. International pressure is not the answer. China is too attached to its flawless image, as demonstrated at events such as the 2008 Beijing Olympic Games, and the lies it has made to the international public about the state of its affairs demonstrate that China is far too attached to its international image to admit defeat on any issue. And we see that the only way to change China's fundamental personality is through the peaceful diplomacy that we recommend. Now, no thank you. Also, the second proposition speaker, when given a POI by my partner LOD, provided no evidence as to why their plan is superior, just made a claim, our plan is better, and backed off. We see this as a sign of a weak model and one that was thrown together hastily with too little thought. Now, the second proposition speaker didn't even attempt to deny that in recent years, as I stated earlier, the rate of progress in human rights has accelerated at precisely the same pace as our peaceful diplomacy. Right. I now move on to my constructive speech. Now, the case that I bring you today is all about the human rights related consequences of the motion at hand. Now, I'd like to preface my argument with a short summary of why might no longer makes right in the fragile plate that is China. Now, with the eyes of the international community on a country, it is pressured to behave to maintain a good image. Now, we see that largely the diplomacy relating to China has not been through military might, but rather through peaceful words. And we see that this has been highly effective in making China the much better, but I note still flawed, state that it is today. And we see that when this external motivation is removed within China, might will make right once again. What kind of might are we talking about here? Not the kind of might that is proven in courts and via international discussions with diplomats, but military might, ladies and gentlemen. We're talking things like the Tiananmen Square massacre. Without the pressure from international countries to improve its human rights, China will have absolutely no reason not to return to the ways of the old regime. Now, this international pressure is why the violence in Tibet, mentioned by the proposition side, is so relatively mild compared to what has happened in China's past before all this diplomacy came into place. It's why the Dalai Lama, also mentioned in the first prop speech, is still alive and has not been taken out by China, who firmly opposes everything that he stands for. Now, the human rights consequences of the motion at hand here. Huge progress has been made in China, and what Prop would do is throw it all away by putting too much pressure on China. We're talking horrific deeds such as the Tiananmen massacre, moving in with tanks and submachine guns on groups of totally justified protesters. We encourage side proposition to have some sympathy when considering the rights and welfare of those living within China, and not just those without. Now, China has shown, before all this progress was made, that it holds no trace of inhibitions regarding the brutal slaughter of the citizens it has a duty to protect. China has only improved due to international pressure made peacefully by diplomacy. That is something that we would really like to stress. Now, there would be no shortage of angry mobs to mow down either. You see, while conditions in China have improved, as I stated earlier, China is still not the best place to live. There are still human rights violations, and the rate of protest has only accelerated as China has gradually loosened its grip. There are still plenty of targets for China to take out in its quest for complete and utter superiority over all of the citizens that it really should be protecting. And in addition, if China can kill so many of its own with relish, how merciful do you, the audience, think that it would be on those who don't even share ancestry with them? We're talking about Tibet here. We're saying that first of all, the Chinese commanders would have little sympathy for those that they don't identify with. And second of all, that Chinese soldiers would not feel nearly as attached to Tibetans as they would to their fellow Chinese. We're talking about a sort of family bond that, however weak, is still a factor when talking about it on such a large scale. There are still going to be protesters in China. While living conditions have improved significantly over the past decade or two, there is no shortage of protest over the remnants of the fading regime. We're talking about the old China that's still restricting access to the internet and is still paying factories shockingly little while chaining them to insufferable conditions that are frankly disgusting and that have people work incredibly long hours and get paid shockingly little and are working in unsafe conditions for which they are completely uninsured. As I stated earlier, China is a work in progress. It's a rather fragile piece of porcelain that will break if we put too much pressure on it. And for this reason, we, on side opposition, are proud to oppose this motion. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, wait, can I start over? Can you stop? Sorry, I didn't press the button. Ladies and gentlemen, today the opposition has given to us their burden of proof. Does the situation is going to be effective after we pass this motion, and does the current diplomatic actions are effective enough? Well, this is exactly our two areas of clash that I'm going to present to you today. First of all, does the diplomatic aspect of the solution, does solving the way diplomatically with words and nice stuff is going to work, is going to be effective, though we have the time also? And second of all, does the effectiveness of the motion is going to be correct, and will China give up quickly enough? Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's move on to our first area of clash, the level of effectiveness for the current diplomatic issues. On this idea, we have 3 points. First of all, the time aspect. Second of all, the sensitivity aspect. Thirdly, power of words. Let's begin with the time issue. Ladies and gentlemen, the political tryouts for releasing Tibet has been taking just way too long. Ladies and gentlemen, for the past 40 years or even more, again and again, those efforts to free Tibet are still going on. 40 years is long enough, and we can never know when it's going to end. Ladies and gentlemen, during this time, innocent Tibetans are being slaughtered in streets. No, thank you. Those people are basically don't have the time. We want those people to live, ladies and gentlemen. This is our main idea, making people live. And this is exactly why, because it is progressing so slow, we basically do not have the time needed in order to wait until China basically said that they don't want Tibet. Yes.
Don't you think that the first step in this process is actually to get China to be talking to the international community, and once they're responsive, then we can talk about Tibet?
Well, they have been talking for the last 40 years. Thank you for listening. Basically, so those 40 years have been too long. Even if it does progress, no thank you. It's progressing way too slow, and I say no thank you. And as I will explain in the second area of clash, it is basically just not as effective as the mechanism that we showed you today. Second aspect, the sensitivity issue. Ladies and gentlemen, again and again, the opposition has mistook the power of China, the reasonability, the way to make choices. Well, even if it was this unreasonable, don't you think that basically, as we said again and again throughout the debate, and the opposition has completely didn't regard it, are there going to be enough irrational to basically financially suicide? Because most of their economical issues are focused on, no thank you, on economy and international trade. Don't you think that a country is supposed to be rational, and a country that develops, as you already said, and being more democratical and more helpful, is going to basically do such a massive kind of stupid thing? No, ladies and gentlemen, and even if well, again, we don't have the time. We should use, in this scenario, not so harsh actually, force. Ladies and gentlemen, it is the only way. It's unfortunate to say this, but we have to do it. Let's get to the third aspect, which is basically about the same. The power of words. Again and again, words are just too slow. We need to act quickly before more people are going to be killed, more innocent people are going to be basically murdered. Yes.
In your plan or in your model, you have a period of time where we increase the sanctions. Don't you think during this time China's resent towards Tibet and consequently the way they treat Tibetans is actually going to get worse?
Well, as I'll get to it in the second area of clash, they won't take these chances of basically financially suicide, and they will give up. If it will be gradually, they won't take their anger out of no thank you, out of the simple Tibetan people. They're going to make the right step and give up, ladies and gentlemen. Moving now to our second area of clash, how the level of effectiveness of the motion, and why in this specific scenario we should use a bit power. Ladies and gentlemen, as the opposition has agreed with us and basically didn't negotiate it with us throughout this entire debate on this clash, China are main to our world. We do agree that they have a massive part, but the world has an even bigger part for them. The entire exportation of their country, their entire economy is based off exporting products. And as we told you before, the graduate sanction are going to reduce this, are going to basically tell slowly no thank you, signaling China that this is going to hurt them. Ladies and gentlemen, this is basically is going to hurt them. And China as a country, as a land with lots of stuff, lots of good people that can basically think, ladies and gentlemen, and assume that once your entire economy is based on exportation, when the exportation area is being removed, it is called financially suicide. Ladies and gentlemen, this clash has been basically completely mistook throughout the entire debate with the opposition. They have they forgot again and again how this how China will not do this kind of stupid thing as suiciding, and in a second, and why even if they are sensitive, it just doesn't worth it. Yes.
Can you give us a recent example of where international sanctions have worked on an economy as powerful as China?
Sorry, I just don't know enough about it, but let me tell you an reasonable analysis that every single person can take. A huge economy that is based on exportation is not going to basically destroy their entire area of economy just because of their ego. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have a candy making factory and you're forbidding them with sugar, they're not going to do anything wrong. They're not going to, I don't know, put heroin instead of sugar. They're going to basically give up and put sugar in their cakes because they need it. This is their main exportation area. And that's just about it. No, thank you. So today I have showed you way too quickly the two areas of clash. First of all, the level of effectiveness of the diplomatical issues, saying that we first of all don't have the time for this for this negotiation. Second of all, we have no complete insurance that it is going to work. And third of all, even if the China may be sensitive, it will work against them, both in the diplomatical issues part, and both it is just way too slow for us, and we want to save people. Second area of clash, level of effectiveness, how China is main to our country and how our land our world, and how the world is main for China itself, and exactly why they won't financially suicide and basically give up free Tibet and give them the right for being a country ruled by itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And finally, I'm calling the last speaker of the opposition to close the case. Ladies and gentlemen, in this heated debate today, we've seen a proposition team that not only has an ineffective model, but they want to make Tibet independent, but they're consistently going about doing it the wrong way. We've seen a proposition team that has a plan that both will not work and will also have many harmful consequences on both Tibet and the international community. On the other hand, you see an opposition team that fully understands the global repercussions of doing something like this to China. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to boil this debate down to three main questions for you today. First of all, will Proposition's plan be sufficient enough to make China give up Tibet? Second of all, what are the consequences for Tibet if China is exiled? And lastly, what are the global consequences if China is exiled from the international community? And what we really see is that side proposition never really addressed our points on all the international consequences that would come about if China was exiled from the international community. But first of all, will this actually make Tibet give up China? Now, what they seem to tell you is that economic sanctions will be enough. But as my first speaker brought up, they can't even name a place where economic sanctions have worked in a country as economically powerful as China. You see, ladies and gentlemen, economic sanctions don't work on a country that is economically as powerful as China. See, they've admitted again and again that China's economy runs on export. Now, we've got two responses to this. First of all, if China already has all the infrastructure and all the workers that are able to make all these products, we see that they'll be fully self-sufficient to be able to make these products for themselves if they're exiled from the international community. The second thing is, ladies and gentlemen, this is a double-sided coin. Just because China exports so much, the rest of the world also relies upon the exports of China. Now, just think about it. China makes toys, clothing, electronics, you name it, China makes it. You know how common that label, made in China, is? Well, now picture if everything with that label on was no longer able to be exported from China. You see, ladies and gentlemen, all the other countries who China exports to rely on China to give them these kinds of exports. These countries wouldn't want to risk they wouldn't want to risk this valuable trading partner with China, otherwise they wouldn't have a source for these cheap products that they're able to currently get from China. And so this is why we see that actually economic sanctions are not going to work, because A, China is fully able to provide for itself, and B, China knows that they have power over the international community in this respect. Yes?
I believe that the welfare and independence of millions of people is a bit more important than us having cheap toys.
Well, I think that our honorable member has misunderstood what I meant. We do think that it's important that Tibet recognizes its independence. What we're proving is that this plan won't actually make Tibetans, free Tibetans from the suppression, because if it doesn't work, then China will be exiled from the community and Tibet will be back in this situation that it already is, but worse. And so that actually leads me very neatly into my second question, which is, what are the consequences for Tibet if China is exiled? So we've already proved that China isn't really going to care that much if the economic sanctions are placed on them. So what are the repercussions on Tibet going to be? Well, as my opposition first member brought up, China is going to be increasingly frustrated with Tibet if Tibet was the one that caused them to have all this tension with the international community. And now we think that when the international community no longer holds any kind of power over China, China will be able to fully take out these frustrations on the Tibetans. Now, what they've tried to tell you is that they're being harassed by China and that China butchers all these Tibetans at will. But we think that this is actually an inaccurate representation. China isn't actually butchering these Tibetans as much as they possibly could be because of the international pressure. Now, China has a reputation for silencing dissenters. However, we see that the Dalai Lama is still able to go around and have like international influence. And we think that the reason that they haven't silenced the Dalai Lama is because this international community is supporting him, is because he's so respected by the international community that if they were to silence him, the international community would be in an uproar. So what we see is that this link between what the international community wants and what how China reacts to how China reacts to Tibet is actually a very solid link. When you take away that link, China can essentially do whatever they want to Tibet. They can do whatever they want to the Dalai Lama because the international community no longer has the power to say, well, that's wrong, because China is now exiled from it. Now, another thing that they said is that it's the responsibility of the international community to fix this problem. And now, we completely agree. But we also think that it's the responsibility of the international community to do what's best for Tibetans. And now, we say that if China is exiled from the international community and takes out these kinds of repercussions on the Tibetans, that this is actually detrimental to the Tibetans. And so the international community will be, in effect, not helping the Tibetans, but actually giving the Tibetans up to be handled by China whatever way China wishes. Now, for this idea that negotiations have been taking too long, now what we would see, as we brought up, is that it's better to work slowly. It's better to keep the lines of negotiation open with China than risking all the negotiations we've ever had, all the progress that China has made, on the whim of this huge risk, when this plan, as we approved, is most likely not even going to work. Ladies and gentlemen, first, we keep China on good terms with us. First, we negotiate with China. Then we figure out how to save Tibet. We don't take this massive risk that has the power to endanger so many lives that are in Tibet. Now, let's look at the last question. What are the consequences to the international community if China is exiled? Well, what we see is that side of proposition, again, never really attacked us on this point. All that they said is that, oh yeah, China will not be resentful of the international community if they get exiled. But we think that, of course it will. Of course China will be resentful that the international community is exiling them. Essentially what the international community is saying to China is that we're not going to treat you with the same kind of respect that we treat other countries with. We're not going to negotiate with you like we negotiate with other countries. Instead, we're going to threaten you. Instead, we're going to make you do this. Yes?
I don't think if China wants to be negotiated correctly with other countries, they should respect other countries in the first place. If they misdo it to that, if they want a good treatment, they should give us a good treatment.
The thing is, what we've been seeing is that the negotiations with China have actually been working. If you look at the recent crackdowns on the protests in China, they have been increasingly getting less and less brutal as time goes on. If you look at China's treatment of the activists in their country, less and less activists have been detained, have been beaten, such as Ai Weiwei. Now, what we would see is that because of the pressures of the international community, because of these negotiations, China is actually listening to the wishes of the international community. Another place we would see this is in the South China Sea. Before, China said that they were never going to give it up. But now that the international community is negotiating with them, China is now able to try and compromise with all these other countries over who gets possession over the South China Sea. So let's look at let's further look at the impacts on the global world. Now, Tibet isn't an isolated issue, ladies and gentlemen. Once China is no longer pressured by the international community, they can essentially do whatever they want. Not only in China, but in not only in Tibet, but in every other issue that involves China. Now, what are other issues? Worker exploitation, South China Sea. China will basically have free reign over these issues to do whatever they want with them. See, all the things that we're making progress towards, we've been trying to open negotiations with China to try and gradually change their mindset. However, if we exile them like this, if we cut them off like this, then we've basically thrown away any progress that we've made with China. And we see that then China will just be able to revert back to its old ways and commit all these human rights violations that we've been trying to stop them from doing. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is for these reasons that we believe we proved our two burdens, that Prop's model will not ensure the return of Tibet, and that the consequences of severing these international links will be detrimental to our society. Ladies and gentlemen, if we push China too hard, it will shatter. This is why, on Side Opposition today, we are proud to oppose. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon once again. What I'm going to do for you now in the opposition reply speech is look at what we think have been the three biggest areas of clash in today's debate, and then I'm going to show you why we think on all three of these issues, impact on economic sanctions, effectiveness of diplomacy, and internal impact, we actually think that side opposition has come out on top today. So let's start by looking at this first big issue, and that's actually the impact of economic sanctions. So today we've seen a proposition team that showed us that we're going to stop trading with China gradually. However, we responded on OP today by showing you that gradual or not, the international community is still going to feel the same economic effects. Now, we've seen this reply that we've talked about how big China's trade is on both sides of the room, and we would agree. We'd say that China has huge economic engagement in the international community. We've talked about, in my speech, them doing things like bailing out the US housing crisis and the EU countries in debt. It's in their best interest, but we've also told you today that if we cut off this trade with China, like proposition would have you do, we lose this help, and we cut off these connections which we think are so important. We've seen a proposition team today that's told us that China is not going to be able to sustain themselves by themselves. Now, this has been furthered by the idea that they wouldn't possibly financially suicide. We have two responses to this line of argumentation, which I'm going to run through now. First of all, we'd say that this increase is actually gradual. They've given us a model where we're slowly going to lay more and more restrictions on China. We'd say, meantime, the conditions for people in Tibet are actually going to get worse. I'm going to address this in the third idea today, internal impact, but we'll get to that in a minute. This idea we won't financially suicide. We've responded to this in POIs with a line of argumentation addressing the effectiveness of sanctions. Recently in the international community, we haven't really seen sanctions work in any place where an economy is as powerful as China's is. We don't think they work as well as side proposition would like to believe and aren't going to be as effective as they would like to believe. Moving on to the second big area of clash today, the effectiveness of diplomacy. Will it work? Today we've seen a proposition that's told us that diplomacy isn't working. We haven't seen any progress in the last 4 years, therefore we need to take action. However, today on side opposition, we've responded that we actually have seen process. We've seen more talks and engagement with China now than we have ever. And we actually think things like ping-pong diplomacy, which I talked about in the first speech, and also concrete improvements to follow these things up. We've talked about how the first step is to get China talking and have that be successful, and then that opens the door to talking about Tibet. Instead, ladies and gentlemen, we've pointed out in opposition today that what this team is proposing to do is increase the resent for Tibet. And we actually think that in the meantime, as long as you increase international pressure on China, you're actually going to find yourselves in a situation where China in turn increases the pressure, the negative pressure on Tibet. We've seen this idea that we don't have the time. However, propositions back this up with a model that's talked about how we're gradually increasing sanctions. We think this is a slow response as well. And even if it has an effect, which we think is unlikely, we think there's still going to be a long period of time with resent. Number two, we've also recognized that this is going to stop all other talks and engagement with China. Negotiations stop, we move backwards. Third big idea today is internal impact. They've told us that war is happening, is that bad? We need to stop it. But we've showed you in speech number 2 that we actually think this is only going to increase resent for the Chinese government, from the Chinese government to the Chinese, and particularly the Tibetans. We think that even worse, you're going to have a long period of time where China can express their frustrations at Tibet and makes the situation they're trying to prevent even worse. We've talked about this idea of international pressure, and we've actually showed you on opposition today that the reason conditions aren't worse is because of the international pressure that exists. And then Sam showed you in the rebuttal and reply that when we take away this international pressure, we actually put ourselves in a situation where China doesn't have these international checks, where they can do whatever we want, and we actually think that's a further problem that makes the situation proposition has come up and tried to prevent today even worse. So ladies and gentlemen, it's because we've won on all three areas, impact of economic sanctions, effectiveness of diplomacy, and internal impact, that we think we've won this debate today. Ladies and gentlemen, if you push China too hard, it will shatter. Thank you.
Finally, I'm welcoming the government's reply speaker to close the meeting.
Ladies and gentlemen, we see that team opposition came up and they talk about the fact that if you push China too far, they will break, basically. But what team proposition suggests is that China is like a brick wall, like a wall made of stone. What opposition team is trying to do, they're trying to push it. They're trying to convince China to push itself. They're trying to convince the wall to move. However, what we come and do is we push this wall. This is what our plan suggests, and we are willing to take some risks in order for us to work for that greater good. Now, in my speech, I'm going to first of all talk about two main ideas that came up in this debate. First of all, the effect on China, on the relations between China and Tibet, and second of all, the impact on the world from that action. So, first of all, the effect on China and the relationship between China and Tibet. So nowadays, we all agree that the situation is bad. Situation is not good between the relations in the relations between China and Tibet. However, and we understand that what we need to do is to take a certain severe step. What team opposition came up here and tried to convince us is to suggest that continue the diplomatic relations that China has, that all the world has with China. And they said that they disagreed with our plan by saying that once you poke China too much, they will explode. However, we say as team proposition that China is not is not poked enough. We've tried everything until that point. We wouldn't suggest such a severe plan, such a plan that we all agree that takes a big risk. However, what team proposition thinks is a risk worth taking, that we wouldn't take this risk if we wouldn't think that everything is working great until now. If we wouldn't think that these relations are actually going to a certain place. Now, once we will take this chance, then China will not take this chance of bringing its whole economy, not like team opposition tried to show us that it wouldn't really affect them, they can help themselves by producing to themselves. It is not a chance worth taking for China. They will not work by this plan. They will not want to risk all its great economy, and they will let go of Tibet, because the only idea that they have behind not giving Tibet, and if we will, and by taking, if they will take this economical suicide, they don't have another reason to do this beside of ego. What we think that China, as a strong country, as a country that understands a thing or two, will take. So, and the second main idea in this debate was the impact on the world. Now, team opposition came out and said that China will get along, China will be able to survive alone. However, the world will not be able to intervene in what happens in China and will not be able to do anything about China. But, as I've already said, if China is able to get, provide things to itself, it would have done it more nowadays. By that we mean that this is a two-sided coin, the whole idea of economy between the world and China. And since the world needs China, China needs the world as well. Once we cut it out, it won't get along. And in addition, although we take a chance, and this is a risk, not a small risk as we've already shown you, this is a risk worth taking in order to reach this important goal of freeing Tibet, of letting the people get their own country, as we've shown you, they deserve this, and they should get us as fast as possible. So thank you, and I beg you to propose.
Thank you very much for this debate. The debaters can shake hands. And then because it's a silent round, we will not give the result, but we will wait for general comments and individual questions.
Thank you. That was a wonderful debate, guys. Well done.
Well done. Congratulations. Well done. Congratulations. Good job.
What are you doing?